A lot of what we talk about here is very intimidating and dark, and I can understand why a lot of people would want to close those doors. Most Americans are acutely unaware of the meddlings of America in international affairs abroad, and the fact that I think since 1950, the United States has bombed more than 32 different countries. Is this something that is good for the American people, for the American image, and for the global economy on a whole? Is this something that is actually implicit to our system of economic livelihood, or is there another way to do it?
Today, Erik Cason takes us into the heart of the military-industrial complex's war machine, exposing how legacy power structures use control and coercion as a tool for domination. Erik discusses how Bitcoin stands against such a powerful institution in the government. He exposes the roots of the war machine, revealing how it operates and why breaking free from its influence might be one of the most significant challenges we face. We'll explore how the money we rely on is part of a greater mechanism of coercion, leading many to realize our freedom is more fragile than we think. We live in a world where governments no longer need permission from their citizens to wage wars, and the very act of war has been monetized in a way that creates massive profits for certain elites. Many of these profits get rolled back into politics, ensuring politicians on either side of the equation don't disrupt the status quo. Prepare to uncover why Erik believes Bitcoin is a way for individuals to reclaim their democratic voting rights over the systems of oppression we do not believe in or support. It's a declaration of freedom and peace against the warmongering establishment. This isn't just a discussion about economics. It's about the fight for freedom, the future of human dignity, and a path towards a more egalitarian and peaceful future. But before we do that, I want to introduce our sponsors, Stampseed, the Orange Pill app, and Swan. Our partners are businesses and people that we respect, and our products that we at Bit Intelligence personally use. You're watching 21 Voices.
Yeah, 2012, joined Coinbase in 2013, helped scale it all the way up until the block size wars where I left. After that, started writing more kind of esoteric philosophical content around Bitcoin. Did a stint at Unchained Capital because I felt what they were building with multisig was really important. And continued to do my writing until I most recently published my book, Crypto Sovereignty, which really is kind of about these more esoteric topics around sort of the philosophical and sociological consequences of what Bitcoin is, and sort of ultimately what I really consider to be an ethical and moral mission about what it means to have a money that people can actually be self-sovereign over versus one that governments control and utilize for their purpose, which I think most people very readily sort of admit and can see that there are very serious problems with the world today, but very few know or understand what sort of solutions there could be. And most are sort of blown away and can't believe that Bitcoin could actually be a very real political solutions to the sort of struggles that they have, but they really struggle with understanding how those whole points connect, which is sort of a lot of what the greater arc of my book sort of tries to address on a multiple number of fronts. So, do you actually know about money? Like, what is it? And like, what do you think backs the US dollar? And surprisingly, you still get a lot of people that believe it's backed by gold, but when you tell them that no, like the government can actually just make it up however they want, and they utilize that to pay for whatever they really choose, they can be quite surprised. And explaining to them that the way that the Bitcoin mining algorithm and supply schedule operates, that there's no conceivable way to make 21 million. And you should be very suspicious in me saying that, because that sounds like, well, somebody could hack it or there's some way to inflate it. And that's why it's really important to go down the route of actually really educating yourself on how it works. Because if you want to get into the code and actually be able to verify for yourself how and why the production schedule of Bitcoin can't be broken, you can absolutely solve that. But I've found the greatest detriment is people believing that they don't have the intelligence or the capacity to be able to understand it. And that's part of this entire broken system, is that most people believe that they have to listen to experts to try to understand something. There are very few professors of economics or finance that have gotten around to supporting Bitcoin because they cannot understand it from an Austrian economic standpoint, and they look at it only through a modern monetary standpoint. And one of the great flaws with that is modern monetary economics has fundamentally at the bottom, it declares that the state should own the monetary system first and foremost before anybody else should be able to own it. And that's really what the 20th century of infinite war was all about, was that because no longer could governments be held to the power of the purse by needing to be able to actually support their fiat currencies with some sort of a hard asset like gold. And so they were able to create huge monetary supplies, which then they dedicated towards things like the war industry, which for me, the reason I got into Bitcoin was first and foremost as an anti-war activist. I'm personally absolutely disgusted with the way that my government has printed out massive sums of money, very much for the support of international wars that were never voted on by American citizens, never approved by American Congress, and are wholly illegal and unconstitutional wars, and yet we have no meaningful way to resist it. And that's very intimidating, because when you try to ask people, well, how do you solve that? They try to say, well, vote for the least worst guy, and that hasn't worked for the last 30 years. And with Bitcoin as a self-sovereign currency that nobody can inflate to infinity, that it can't be stolen if you people have self-sovereignty over it, it becomes a very real and powerful political movement for people to not only withdraw their approval and wealth from the fiat system, but for when governments come after them with things like CBDCs and really try to lock them into a system they can't escape from, there'll still be a capacity to actually have a self-sovereign money that governments won't be able to steal, no matter what they've just sort of declared you to be a criminal of. You actually have the ability to resist the government being able to steal all of your wealth because what they say you're doing is wrong. World War I being the first real truly global scale conflict, with the absolute toll of death and weight that it put on the international economy, this is when they first started issuing war bonds, because it wasn't actually capable for us to just fund directly from the Treasury to be able to support these wars. This is also why in 1918 we actually had the introduction of income tax on a whole, which was something that the American public had never had before, and it was only supposed to be an emergency decree to help see us through the war. And so the Federal Reserve was created in 1908 after there was a pretty major depression that had happened where JP Morgan had to come in and bail out the US government. And after that, the government said, well, we need to have our own sovereign currency that can't be controlled by anybody, that we can issue on our own. And that's how we got the third bank of the United States, which is known as the Federal Reserve, which there's nothing federal about it. It's actually a private institution that's owned by the 12 largest banks in the United States. And so all that happened here was, instead of us having a secure money that was backed by something like gold, we actually pivoted to saying, well, it's still supported by gold, but the largest banks are going to be issuing this new currency. And so fast forward into 1933, we're in the throes of the Great Depression. It looks like we're going into the second slump of it. It's a very real crisis. And FDR comes in and he declares, nobody can actually hold gold anymore. We're going to go to all the banks. We're going to seize their gold. We're going to go to gold dealers' homes. We're going to seize their gold. And in exchange, we'll give them $20 for each ounce of gold. Within a year, the price of gold had essentially doubled. And government now controlled the full gold supply. And now at the beginning of what would end up becoming the Second World War, the government now had the ability to not only issue war bonds, but to actually start printing out money and using that for things like the Manhattan Project and other large-scale industrial war industries. And so at the end of World War II, there was the Bretton Woods Accords, which essentially the gold standard had failed, and there was a need for a new international monetary system. And in the production of that new monetary system, it pretty much became that America was now going to be the global issuer of an international currency. And originally, this actually was something that was going to be called the Bancor currency. But at the very end, the American administration essentially decided that they'd replace the Bancor with the dollar. And so the idea was that we'd export dollars abroad. When international countries would want to get money for their dollar, they'd come back to the United States and cash it out for gold. Well, in 1962, the French got very suspicious that we didn't have the ability to actually cover that anymore. And so the French withdrew all their gold, and at that point, the gold standard was ended. Again, under an emergency decree that it wasn't going to be for forever, but at that point, the US dollar actually became a totally free-floating currency, not backed by anything except for the debt of the United States. And ever since then, we've been printing out money for whatever causes we wanted, and in this case, it was specifically for the Vietnam War. And so there's always this endemic relationship that it turns out that war is a catastrophic industry that harms the vast majority of people and individuals as a net negative for humanity on a whole. Yet it can be financed by fiat money printing, because they specifically just print out the money and then give it to their cronies that they have in government that are printing out weapons of mass destruction for the very real causes of catastrophes abroad. Which, if you've ever had an opportunity to visit somewhere like Cambodia, you will meet dozens of children that will follow you around with limbs blown off from American munitions that were used to illegally make war against those people in that country. And to me, this is really the tale of the 20th century, is that we unleash these horrific war machines that really understood that a small percentage of people who own those war industries could profit off of the violence and destructions of other people, which frankly, 70 years after, it has not made the world a safer place, but it's made it a much more dangerous one. And if we would just look at what the attacks of September 11th were, that was specifically blowback from all of the catastrophe that we had made go on in places like Afghanistan, with us wanting to get the Soviets out of there, with no understanding that by us financing a 30-year war that was going on in Afghanistan, at the end of it, the Mujahideen, who were originally our allies, would now become the foremost enemies of the American public. And so I just don't believe that there's anything to be won through the violence, destruction, and murder of other innocent people that have nothing to do with America, and they've never been to America. And frankly, if they would meet American citizens face to face, they'd probably find very real human beings that they could find a lot more common ground with than our medias would want us to believe.
Please bear with us for a quick message from our sponsors. These videos take a lot of time to make, and we've partnered with brands we trust like Stampseed and the Orange Pill app in order to get the funding we need to bring you these videos every week. Don't store your Bitcoin in cold storage without stamping your seed phrase on an indestructible titanium plate. Stampseed is fireproof, rust-proof, impact-proof, and easy to hide. It has no loose parts and will give you ultimate peace of mind that your Bitcoin is safe and sound for the long term. Click the link in the description below for 15% off your stamping kit. When I finally got Bitcoin, it hit me like a lightning bolt. It was the currency of the future, the only money that truly mattered. But there was a problem. I didn't know anyone else that thought like me. That is until I discovered the Orange Pill app. Suddenly, I was connected with a network of like-minded Bitcoin enthusiasts, right in my own city. The Orange Pill app is more than just a social network. It's a community of passionate individuals determined to change the world, one Satoshi at a time. This series is brought to you by Swan and created by Bit Intelligence. Remember to like this video and subscribe to both our channels for more videos like this every week. Thanks for watching.
There's pictures that are very real, not AI generated, of Osama bin Laden and Donald Rumsfeld shaking hands, because Rumsfeld was one of the advisors that advised for this to happen in the 1980s. And this is one of the saddest things, is that most Americans are acutely unaware of the meddlings of America in international affairs abroad, and the fact that I think since 1950, the United States has bombed more than 32 different countries. You know, it's quite horrific and terrifying when I've met Bitcoiners that are close friends of mine, and they've had to tell me about the terror of hiding in basements while American bombs were dropped on them when they were children. You know, and that's one of those things that I can't idly stand by and let these sort of ethical crimes happen when, sure, there wasn't a way to deal with it up until 2010, but now that we actually have Bitcoin, that it's deployed, it's decentralized, it's robust, it's a well-protected and well-battle-tested network, there's an actual real ability for us to start a conversation about what does it mean that we now have a self-sovereign money that everybody can hold, that can't be inflated and can't be controlled by governments around the world, whether that's the Chinese Communist government, the American imperialist government, or any other governments abroad, that we could actually make a choice to stop financing these endemic wars that, as Americans, that is one of the largest line items in our budget, which ironically and sadly is only outdone now by our interest payments in terms of the total federal budget. You know, even with Bitcoin now being a $1.2 trillion asset class, that is equivalent only to the United States federal budget for 1 year now. That's absolutely absurd, because that was the same amount of money that financed all of America up until the 1970s. It's a very sad and endemic affair, is that, again, like I don't believe we're supposed to have some political will suddenly rise up with people electing the right people who just do the right thing. It's very much at how the system is built. They're not going to get elected unless they support the arms producers, who then are going to sponsor their campaign in order to get kickbacks for doing this. And it's a very sad problem that I think in the fiat system itself, it cannot solve itself, because of it's the same way like asking a heroin addict to try to kick their heroin problem by just doing a little bit more heroin each day to try to kick the habit down for the next time that they really need to try to stop the conflict. In all honesty, we're now at a place in global development that the interdependency of nations are so deep with one another that this truly is a global conflict. And I think that's one reason why us here as Americans in Australia can be having many of the same conversations with Australian citizens that we were having with citizens in, saying, Madeira as well, with all of the different international folks that were there, is because we're all facing the same problems. Our governments are no longer actually limited in any meaningful way by the power of the purse, and so they choose for whatever projects they want, whether they're crazy public works projects or just, like in America, financing international wars in places like Ukraine and Yemen. We don't have any way to say, this isn't something we approve of. We can't vote on it. We can't ask our representatives to vote on those things. And so we're kind of caught in this very dangerous and difficult scenario where we don't have a meaningful way to stop the sort of financing of all of these things that we don't agree with in any democratic way. Just look at the war in Iraq and the way that we were absolutely lied to about the fact that there are weapons of mass destruction there, the way that that caused for 1 million Iraqis to lose their lives. And despite the fact that we were so convinced that there were weapons of mass destruction there, the first thing that was secured were the oil wells. It turns out that this wasn't a conflict at all about Saddam having weapons of mass destruction. It was about the fact that we needed his oil, and we were terrified in the fact that he was going to try to start selling his oil for something that wasn't US dollars. And this is exactly what happened in Libya at the same time. As Muammar Gaddafi, he was getting tired of being pushed around by the Americans, so he was going to start selling oil for gold instead of for dollars. Well, if you want to threaten the petrodollar, you threaten the petro side first, and that assures that you're going to get toppled in your regime. It's pretty disgusting that Americans who, really had an isolationist strategy all the way up to World War I, in this, 21st century, we've somehow found ourselves to be the world police, not being asked or welcomed by anybody, but mostly because there are corporate interests that through using American empire, they can exploit people in different ways abroad. And that's really kind of the grand tale of what we did in Central America all throughout the 20th century. We pretty much installed a number of different dictators who would serve our interests. If there was anybody who rose up in a place that wasn't for our interests, we made sure to topple them. And that happened, I think, at least 24 times throughout Central and South America in the 20th century. And the real question is this something that is good for the American people, for the American image, and for the global economy on a whole? And I think we can see unequivocally no, that wars are these horrific and destructive economic processes that destroy the very capacities of people, not only to live, but then they have to live under the guise of fear and violence just by living where they do. I think that's a terrifying and hideous thing, and I think that all people everywhere need to actually ask themselves, is this something that is actually implicit to our system of economic livelihood, or is there another way to do it? And I think the answer is now that we have the internet and the robust capacities and capabilities of what not only cryptography can do, but what the promises of Bitcoin actually offers and delivers on, there is a very real new hope that we could create a new economic and monetary system that can be much more equitable and egalitarian for all people, so that no longer do we have to face and suffer under governments choosing to tax us exorbitant amounts to be able to make and finance these wars that we have no agreement with, but we can actually create robust circular economies with one another where people don't have to support those things. When you call something a conspiracy theory, that's because you don't want to try to think about it. You can actually try it on for a moment, look at the logical facts of it and go, this doesn't make any sense at all. It doesn't line up. I can now put that away in the box of knowing that that stuff's not true. But simply just trying to declare something a conspiracy theory and not follow the reasoning through is childish and irresponsible. And it goes to show that you don't want to do the research or the work to try to actually take on that maybe this thing is just too big for you to consider, because I want to be the first to admit a lot of what we talk about here is very intimidating and dark. And I can understand why a lot of people would want to close those doors, because it's very difficult to look at, because then you have to start to admit, wow, if these things are actually true, maybe I do have a real responsibility to take it seriously instead of just closing the book and turning on whatever sports ball is on the channel.
Reflecting on Erik's perspective, we see a global system whose gears are driven by mechanisms that seem almost impossible to influence, let alone change. The illusion of control through democratic process feels painfully stripped away when you understand the disturbing truth of how deeply intertwined global interests, economies, and conflicts have become. Our modern lives often rely on systems we rarely question, systems funded by institutions we might actually want to challenge. Bitcoin, in this light, becomes an avenue towards economic self-sovereignty for the entire globe that isn't shackled to the same old destructive, vicious cycle. it challenges us to consider that there might just be another way. I think this is the primary difference between Bitcoiners and people who do not yet understand or ignore this technology. Bitcoiners have discovered that there is, in fact, a way to dismantle the current system, slowly, sequentially, over time, in a voluntary and peaceful way that benefits everyone who chooses to partake in this once-in-a-civilization monetary revolution. There is, in fact, a version of the future that looks far more hopeful than the broken fiat system racing towards the next world war and a new global reserve currency. Bitcoin is the only way we break this cycle of collapse that Samson Mow describes in this next episode here. So don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to our channel for more videos like this every week.